Good evening, and welcome to Whispered History. Tonight we're traveling to the vast deserts and rugged mountains of the American Southwest, where towering cliffs glow beneath the setting sun, ancient rivers carve their way through deep canyons, and endless skies stretch farther than the eye can see. This is the story of the Apache Wars, but not the version often told through dramatic battles and famous names. Instead, tonight we'll slow our pace and quietly explore the remarkable landscapes, the everyday lives, and the people whose worlds changed over the course of nearly a century. Together we'll wander through peaceful valleys, climb rocky mountain trails, visit lonely frontier forts, and discover how one of the longest conflicts in American history unfolded across some of North America's most breathtaking scenery. As always, our goal isn't excitement, it's relaxation. So settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you haven't already, and allow yourself to drift gently into the past. And before we begin, if you enjoy these long-form history journeys, I'd truly appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Whispered History if you haven't already. Every like, every comment, and every subscription helps this channel reach more people who love peaceful history as much as you do. If there's another historical story you'd like to fall asleep to, let me know in the comments. I always enjoy reading your suggestions, and they often inspire future videos. Now, take one slow breath. Let the worries of today quietly fade into the distance, and together, let's journey back to the American Southwest, long before railroads crossed the desert, long before frontier forts stood watch over lonely valleys, long before maps divided the land into states and territories. The Southwest followed rhythms that had remained unchanged for countless generations. Morning sunlight slowly spilled across towering mesas. Golden rays crept over jagged peaks before reaching the valleys below. The cool desert air carried the scent of sagebrush and juniper. Cottonwood leaves whispered beside winding streams. Far above, hawks circled effortlessly on rising currents of warm air. To someone seeing this landscape for the first time, it might appear empty. Miles upon miles of rocky hills, broad deserts, scattered grasslands, and distant mountains fading into a blue horizon. Yet nothing about this land was empty. It was alive. Every canyon offered shelter. Every spring supported plants and animals. Every mountain pass connected one valley to another. The people who called this region home knew these places with remarkable precision. They recognized the changing colors of distant cliffs. They understood where rainwater gathered after summer storms. They remembered hidden springs tucked beneath rocky ledges. They could read tracks left in the sand long after sunrise. What looked harsh to outsiders often felt familiar to those who had lived there for generations. The Southwest itself was unlike any other part of North America, stretching across what is now Arizona, New Mexico, western Texas, northern Mexico, and portions of neighboring states. It contained an extraordinary variety of landscapes. Towering mountain ranges interrupted broad desert basins. Dense pine forests covered high elevations. Open grasslands spread between rocky hills. Narrow rivers brought life to otherwise dry country. During the summer, powerful thunderstorms rolled across the mountains. Lightning flashed above distant peaks. For a few brief weeks, the desert burst into surprising shades of green. Wildflowers appeared where only dry soil had rested days before. Tiny streams flowed through arroyos that remained dry for most of the year. Then, just as quietly, the rains moved on. The land returned to its familiar golden browns and soft greens. Life adapted to these constant changes. Prickly pear cactus stored precious water. Mesquite trees stretched long roots deep beneath the earth. Jackrabbits moved silently through desert grasses. Coyotes greeted the evening with distant calls that echoed between rocky hills. Mule deer grazed in shaded valleys during the cool hours of morning. Black bears wandered mountain forests far above the desert floor. Even the smallest spring became an important gathering place for countless living creatures. Water determined nearly everything. Those who understood where to find it could travel confidently across great distances. Those who did not faced enormous challenges. The mountains themselves formed natural worlds of their own. From a distance, they appeared quiet and still, but climbing into their forests revealed cool streams, towering ponderosa pines, shaded meadows, and hidden valleys that felt entirely different from the desert below. Temperatures dropped. Fresh breezes replaced the dry heat. Birdsong filled the trees. These mountain refuges became places of safety during the hottest months of the year. Far below, the desert shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The contrast between mountain and valley shaped every journey across the Southwest. Travel rarely followed straight lines. Instead, people learned to move with the landscape. They followed washes after seasonal rains. They crossed mountain passes known only through generations of experience. They rested beside dependable springs. Distance was measured not simply by miles, but by water, by weather, by elevation, and by the changing seasons. The night sky held equal importance. Far from cities and artificial light, the stars appeared with astonishing brilliance. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a pale river of light. Constellations slowly turned across the heavens. Moonlight transformed rocky cliffs into soft silver shapes. Travelers often continued beneath those stars, guided by familiar landmarks that remained unchanged year after year. Time itself seemed different here. The Southwest encouraged patience. The seasons moved gradually. The land revealed itself only to those willing to observe carefully. A sudden storm could reshape a dry wash. A long drought might shrink a familiar spring. A wet summer filled valleys with grasses. Each year brought subtle changes, yet the larger rhythms endured for countless generations. Families lived within these cycles. Children learned the names of plants before they learned distant places. They watched elders read the landscape with quiet confidence. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next, not from books, but from experience. A certain canyon always held shade during summer afternoons. A particular spring remained reliable even during dry years. Certain plants ripened at nearly the same time every season. Certain trails became difficult after heavy rains. Everything was connected. The land taught patience, observation, respect. Long before history books would describe this region as a frontier, it was already home. Home to communities with rich traditions, deep family connections, and an extraordinary understanding of one of the continent's most beautiful and demanding landscapes. The story we are beginning tonight cannot be understood without first appreciating that truth. Before soldiers marched across these valleys, before wagon roads crossed the deserts, before telegraph wires stretched between distant settlements, there existed a world shaped almost entirely by nature, a world where sunrise marked the beginning of each day's work, where mountains offered protection, where rivers brought life, and where every journey depended upon knowing the land as though it were an old friend. In our next chapter, we will meet the people who knew this remarkable country better than anyone else, the Apache themselves. Together, we'll explore their daily lives, their families, their traditions, and the remarkable skills that allowed them to thrive in one of North America's most extraordinary landscapes. As the first light of dawn spread across the mountains, the desert slowly awakened. Long shadows stretched across the valley floor. The cool air carried the earthy scent of damp sand left behind by the night's dew. Birds emerged from the cottonwood trees that lined the creeks. Far above, the sky shifted from deep violet to pale gold. It was a familiar beginning to another day. For the Apache people, the land itself was the first teacher. Every mountain had a story. Every spring held importance. Every winding canyon offered lessons passed from one generation to the next. The word Apache is one that many people recognize today. Yet it is important to understand that it did not describe a single unified nation. Instead, it referred to several closely related groups who shared similar languages and many cultural traditions, while maintaining their own identities and territories. Among them were the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Western Apache, Jicarilla, Lipan, and Plains Apache. Each group adapted to the unique landscapes they called home. Some lived among towering mountain ranges. Others traveled across broad grasslands. Still others occupied desert basins, where water was precious and every journey required careful planning. Although they spoke related languages, each community developed its own customs, leaders, and seasonal routines. To outsiders, the differences were often difficult to recognize, but among the Apache themselves, these distinctions were well understood. Family formed the center of daily life. Unlike large cities or permanent villages found elsewhere in North America, many Apache families lived in smaller bands. These groups often consisted of several related families who traveled, hunted, and worked together throughout the year. Life remained flexible. Families gathered when cooperation was needed. At other times, they separated into smaller groups to make the best use of available food and water. This way of living allowed them to adapt to a landscape that constantly changed with the seasons. Their homes reflected this flexibility. One of the most common dwellings was the wickiup. Built from bent poles covered with grass, brush, reeds, or hides, these shelters could be constructed surprisingly quickly. They provided shade during the hot months and protection against cool desert nights. Smoke escaped through an opening near the top. Inside, the space remained simple but comfortable. Blankets covered the ground. Cooking tools rested near the fire. Personal belongings were carefully organized. Everything served a purpose. When it became time to move, many of the materials could be gathered again at the next camp. Nothing was unnecessarily heavy. Children grew up surrounded by both freedom and responsibility. From an early age, they learned by watching. There were few formal lessons. Instead, knowledge came through observation. A young child might accompany older family members while gathering edible plants. Another might watch carefully as an elder repaired a bow. Gradually, small tasks became larger ones. Skills developed naturally through daily life. Boys often learned to hunt by following experienced relatives into the mountains. Girls mastered important household skills while also learning about plants, water sources, and caring for younger children. Although certain responsibilities often followed traditional roles, everyone contributed to the well-being of the family. Survival depended upon cooperation. Food came from many different sources. The Southwest offered remarkable variety for those who understood where to look. Deer provided meat in the mountains. Rabbits could often be found across open country. Wild turkey, quail, and other birds added to the diet. Fish were caught in rivers and streams where conditions allowed, but hunting alone could never support every family. Gathering plants proved equally important. Women possessed extensive knowledge of edible roots, berries, seeds, nuts, cactus fruit, and agave. The agave plant was especially valuable. Its heart could be slowly roasted beneath layers of hot stones for many hours until it became sweet and nourishing. Mesquite beans were ground into flour. Acorns from oak forests were carefully prepared. prickly pear cactus produced fruit during certain seasons. Even seemingly barren landscapes offered remarkable abundance to those who understood them. Water remained the greatest treasure. Finding dependable springs required experience that could not be learned quickly. Some springs flowed year-round. Others appeared only after seasonal rains. Families remembered these locations across generations. Travel routes often connected one dependable water source to another. Visitors unfamiliar with the country sometimes wondered how anyone could survive in such dry surroundings. The answer lay not in the land itself, but in understanding it. The Apache did not attempt to force the desert into becoming something else. Instead, they learned to live within its natural rhythms. Clothing reflected both practicality and craftsmanship. Buckskin remained common for many garments because it was durable and comfortable. During colder months, heavier hides offered warmth in the mountains. Moccasins protected feet from sharp rocks, thorny plants, and scorching ground. Every item required careful work. Preparing animal hides demanded patience. Sewing garments by hand required remarkable skill. Nothing was wasted. Tools were equally practical. Bows crafted from sturdy wood became reliable hunting companions. Arrows were carefully balanced for accuracy. Stone tools continued to be used alongside items obtained through trade. As contact with Spanish and later Mexican settlements increased, metal knives, kettles, and other goods gradually became more common. Yet traditional knowledge remained just as valuable. An experienced hunter still depended far more upon patience and careful observation than upon the newest equipment. Community life centered around cooperation. When large game was successfully hunted, the meat was shared. Families helped one another construct shelters. Knowledge flowed freely between generations. Stories were told around evening fires after the day's work had ended. These stories carried lessons. Some explained the origins of the world. Others taught respect for nature, courage, generosity, or wisdom. Children listened carefully, not because they were required to, but because these stories connected them to those who had come before. Music also held an important place. Songs accompanied ceremonies, celebrations, healing practices, and important gatherings. Their rhythms echoed across quiet valleys long before outsiders ever heard them. Spiritual beliefs remained deeply connected to the natural world. Mountains, animals, rivers, plants, and the changing seasons were not viewed as separate from daily life. Instead, everything existed within a larger relationship that deserved respect. Ceremonies marked important moments throughout a person's life. Healing traditions combined practical knowledge with spiritual understanding, developed over countless generations. Although specific customs varied among different Apache groups, the connection between people and the land remained constant. Leadership, too, differed from what many outsiders expected. There were respected leaders, but leadership was rarely based upon absolute authority. Instead, influence was earned. A leader gained trust through wisdom, generosity, courage, experience, and sound judgment. People chose to follow because they respected the individual, not because they were forced. This flexibility allowed communities to adapt quickly when circumstances changed. As the sun slowly disappeared each evening, campfires flickered beneath the stars. Families gathered together after another day of travel, hunting, gathering, or tending to daily responsibilities. Meals were shared. Children drifted toward sleep while listening to familiar voices. Above them, the same brilliant stars that shine over the Southwest today stretched endlessly across the sky. It was a peaceful world, one shaped not by clocks, nor by written borders, but by the steady rhythm of seasons and the quiet wisdom of generations. Yet beyond the distant horizon, Change was slowly approaching. Explorers from another continent had already begun entering the Southwest. With them came unfamiliar animals, new technologies, different customs, and entirely different ideas about land, settlement, and power. The first meetings between these very different worlds would reshape the Southwest forever. And that is where our journey will continue in the next chapter. As another sunrise warmed the rugged mountains of the Southwest, the land appeared much as it always had. Golden light spilled across broad valleys. Cottonwood trees shimmered beside quiet streams. A cool breeze drifted through forests of ponderosa pine, high above the desert floor. The familiar rhythms of daily life continued. Families prepared morning meals. Hunters set out before the day's heat settled across the land. Children followed older relatives, learning the countless lessons that could only be taught by experience. For generations, these landscapes had changed slowly. The passing seasons shaped life far more than the actions of distant people. Yet beyond the horizon, across an immense ocean, powerful events were quietly unfolding. During the late 15th and early 16th centuries, European kingdoms were searching for new trade routes, new opportunities, and greater knowledge of lands that were almost entirely unknown to them. Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic. Explorers reached islands and coastlines unfamiliar to Europe. With each new expedition, maps gradually expanded. Places once imagined only through rumor slowly became real. Far to the north of Spain's earliest settlements, in the Americas stretched an enormous region that would later become the American Southwest. At first, very few Europeans knew much about it. Stories traveled faster than facts. Some spoke of wealthy kingdoms hidden among distant mountains. Others imagined cities filled with gold. Many of these stories grew larger each time they were told. In reality, the Southwest was something far different. Its greatest riches were not cities built of precious metals. They were rivers flowing through dry country, mountain forests filled with wildlife, hidden springs, ancient trade routes, and generations of knowledge held by the people who already called the region home. One of the earliest Spanish expeditions to enter portions of the Southwest took place during the 16th century. Small groups of explorers, soldiers, guides, and religious missionaries traveled across unfamiliar landscapes. Their journeys were slow, the distances enormous. Water remained difficult to find. Many routes crossed deserts unlike anything most Europeans had previously experienced. To them, the Southwest could seem endless. Mountains rose unexpectedly from broad valleys. Dry riverbeds suddenly filled during seasonal storms. Days brought intense heat. Nights often turned surprisingly cool. Travel required patience. Animals played a central role in these expeditions. Perhaps none would prove more influential than the horse. Although horses had once lived in North America thousands of years earlier, they had disappeared long before recorded history. The animals brought by Spanish explorers represented their return. At first, only Europeans owned horses. They carried soldiers across difficult country, pulled supplies, transported messages between distant settlements. Few could have imagined how greatly these animals would eventually reshape life throughout much of Western North America. The earliest meetings between Spanish explorers and Apache communities varied greatly. Some encounters were peaceful. Curiosity often existed on both sides. People observed unfamiliar clothing, different tools, new languages, strange customs. Trade sometimes followed: food, animal hides, metal goods, cloth. Each offered something the other considered useful. Communication, however, was rarely easy. Without a shared language, even simple conversations required patience, gestures, careful observation, skilled interpreters whenever they could be found. Misunderstandings happened naturally. A custom considered respectful by one culture might appear confusing to another. Ideas about leadership differed. Ideas about land ownership differed even more. For many Apache communities, the landscape was not something to be divided by permanent boundaries. Families moved seasonally. Resources were shared according to long-established traditions. Knowledge of the land mattered far more than written claims upon it. The Spanish brought a very different understanding. They established settlements, created provinces, granted land through royal authority, constructed missions, built permanent communities intended to remain for generations. These contrasting views did not immediately lead to conflict. For many years, trade remained an important part of daily life. Metal tools attracted considerable interest. Iron knives held sharp edges far longer than stone blades. Copper kettles proved useful for cooking. Colorful woven cloth offered new possibilities. Glass beads appeared in decorative work. In return, the Spanish acquired animal hides, food, and valuable local knowledge. Guides familiar with the country became especially important. No map could replace someone who understood hidden springs, mountain passes, or safe travel routes. As years passed, horses slowly spread beyond Spanish settlements. Some were traded, others wandered away. Still others were captured during raids or recovered after becoming lost. Whatever their path, the horse gradually transformed travel throughout the Southwest. Journeys that once required several days could now be completed more quickly. Hunters reached distant valleys with greater ease. Families transported supplies more efficiently. The animal became deeply woven into everyday life. Spanish settlements slowly expanded. Mission churches appeared beside rivers. Small farming communities cultivated wheat, corn, beans, and livestock. Soldiers protected roads connecting one settlement to another. Merchants traveled between growing towns, carrying goods from far away. Yet these settlements remained widely separated. Between them stretched hundreds of miles of open country, deserts, mountains, forests, grasslands. Much of the Southwest continued much as it always had. Nature still determined the rhythm of life. Summer monsoon storms swept across rocky peaks. Winter snow covered high mountains. Spring brought fresh grasses to sheltered valleys. The land remained stronger than any individual settlement. Throughout these years, Apache families continued adapting, as they always had. They observed newcomers carefully. They learned which goods proved useful, which settlements welcomed trade, which routes should be avoided. Knowledge remained their greatest strength. The Southwest rewarded careful observation above all else. Occasionally, tensions developed. Livestock wandered. Resources became scarce during difficult seasons. Misunderstandings over trade or territory sometimes occurred. Most frontier disagreements began not with dramatic battles, but with ordinary problems. A missing horse, a disputed hunting ground, a misunderstanding between travelers who shared neither language nor customs. Such moments remind us that history often changes gradually. Large conflicts rarely appear without warning. Instead, they grow from many small events, spread across years, sometimes even generations. Neither the Apache nor the Spanish could fully foresee what lay ahead. Each adapted to changing circumstances as best they could. Each believed they were protecting their families, communities, and futures. Meanwhile, the Southwest itself remained patient. The mountains watched silently over every passing generation. The rivers continued flowing through ancient valleys. Cottonwood leaves rustled beside familiar streams. Coyotes greeted another evening beneath brilliant stars. Nature endured while human history slowly unfolded across its vast landscape. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the Southwest became increasingly connected to distant governments, expanding settlements, and growing trade networks. New opportunities appeared, but so did new challenges. The quiet balance that had existed for generations would gradually become more difficult to maintain. In our next chapter, we will see how the Southwest changed after Mexico gained its independence from Spain, and how shifting governments, expanding settlements, and changing frontiers slowly set the stage for the long years that would eventually become known as the Apache Wars. The years passed quietly across the Southwest. One season followed another. Winter snow settled gently upon the highest mountain peaks before slowly melting into streams that nourished valleys below. Spring brought fresh grasses across the open plains. Summer thunderstorms rolled across the desert, filling dry washes with rushing water for only a few brief hours before disappearing once again beneath clear blue skies. Autumn returned cooler mornings and long golden evenings. The land followed rhythms far older than any government, far older than any map, far older than the borders that people would continue drawing across it. For Apache families, life continued according to these familiar cycles. Children grew into skilled hunters and gatherers. Elders shared stories beneath evening skies filled with brilliant stars. Families traveled between mountain forests and desert valleys as they had done for generations, always mindful of weather, water, and the changing seasons. Yet beyond the horizon, another quiet transformation was unfolding. It would not arrive with a single battle or dramatic announcement. Instead, it came through politics, through distant decisions made in cities hundreds of miles away, through changes in governments that many people living in the Southwest would not immediately notice. In 1821, after years of struggle, Mexico gained its independence from Spain. The vast northern frontier, including present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and much of the surrounding region, was no longer governed from Madrid. Instead, it became part of a new nation. For many people living in the Southwest, daily life did not change overnight. The mountains remained the same. The rivers followed their familiar courses. The desert still demanded patience and respect. But the officials overseeing settlements changed. New laws gradually appeared. Military responsibilities shifted. Trade slowly expanded in different directions. The frontier entered a new chapter. Mexico inherited an enormous territory. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was also incredibly difficult to govern. Distances between settlements remained enormous. Roads were often little more than well-used trails. Messages traveled slowly by horseback. A letter sent from central Mexico might take weeks or even months to reach distant frontier communities. Small towns often relied upon their own local leaders to solve everyday problems. The frontier demanded independence. People learned to depend upon neighbors long before help could arrive from distant capitals. Throughout northern Mexico, settlements remained scattered. Some were farming communities built beside dependable rivers. Others were ranches where cattle, horses, sheep, and goats grazed across wide grasslands. Mining towns searched for silver and copper hidden beneath rugged mountains. Mission communities continued serving both religious and practical roles. Life on the frontier required hard work. Water had to be carefully managed. Homes needed constant repair against wind, sun, and sudden storms. Travel between settlements remained challenging. Yet opportunities attracted new arrivals. Families seeking land moved northward. Merchants followed expanding trade routes. Ranchers searched for fresh grazing lands. The frontier slowly became busier. For Apache communities, these changes brought new opportunities as well as new concerns. Trade remained an important part of daily life. Many Apache bands exchanged animal hides, woven goods, livestock, and local knowledge for metal tools, cloth, horses, and other useful supplies. Trade fairs sometimes brought together people from very different backgrounds. Languages mixed, ideas spread, friendships occasionally formed between individuals who had grown to respect one another through repeated exchanges. But peaceful trade existed alongside growing competition. Livestock became especially valuable. A horse represented transportation. A mule carried heavy loads across difficult country. Cattle and sheep provided food, leather, and wealth. Owning animals increasingly shaped the frontier economy. Unfortunately, livestock also became one of the most common sources of disagreement. Animals wandered naturally across open landscapes. Fences were rare across much of the Southwest. A horse grazing freely could travel many miles. Sometimes an animal simply became lost. Sometimes it was claimed by another owner. Sometimes it was intentionally taken. Determining exactly what had happened was often impossible. One missing horse might appear insignificant, yet on the frontier it could represent months of labor. For a family relying upon that animal, its disappearance created real hardship. As these small disputes accumulated, trust slowly became more difficult to maintain. Periods of drought added further challenges. Rainfall in the Southwest has always been unpredictable. Some summers brought generous storms, others remained painfully dry. Spring shrank, grass disappeared from open valleys, wild game became harder to find. Families across every community, Apache, Mexican settlers, ranchers, farmers, and traders alike, faced difficult decisions during these lean years. Competition for limited resources naturally increased, not because people wished for conflict, but because survival demanded difficult choices. Raiding had existed long before Mexico gained independence. Among many communities across the Southwest, including various indigenous peoples and frontier settlements, raids sometimes served different purposes. Livestock might be taken, supplies recovered, revenge sought for earlier losses. These events were rarely simple. Each community often remembered its own hardships more clearly than those experienced by others. One raid frequently led to another. Cycles of retaliation slowly developed. A family mourning stolen animals remembered that loss. Another family remembered a different event from years before. History became layered with memory. Each generation inherited stories of both friendship and hardship. Meanwhile, trade continued. It is easy to imagine the frontier as a place of constant conflict. The reality was far more complicated. Many peaceful exchanges occurred every year. Merchants welcomed returning customers. Guides helped travelers cross difficult country. Neighbors sometimes warned one another about approaching storms or dangerous conditions. Not every meeting ended in violence. Far from it. Most days were occupied by ordinary work, repairing roofs, planting crops, gathering firewood, preparing food, caring for children, watching the weather. History often remembers battles. Yet daily life was built upon countless peaceful routines that rarely appear in written records. The landscape itself encouraged cooperation whenever possible. Travel remained dangerous enough without unnecessary enemies. A traveler lost in unfamiliar country might depend entirely upon someone else's knowledge of hidden water sources. Hospitality could save lives. Likewise, experience remained more valuable than strength. An elder who knew dozens of reliable springs possessed knowledge impossible to replace. A skilled tracker could read footprints left hours earlier across rocky ground. A seasoned guide recognized approaching weather simply by observing distant clouds gathering above mountain peaks. These abilities earned deep respect. Across northern Mexico, small military garrisons attempted to protect settlements and trade routes, yet soldiers faced enormous challenges. The frontier stretched across thousands of square miles. Mountain ranges offered countless hidden valleys. Deserts concealed travelers beneath shimmering heat. No army could watch every trail. Communication remained slow. Supplies often arrived late. Many isolated settlements learned to protect themselves as best they could. Despite these difficulties, the Southwest remained a place of extraordinary beauty. Evening sunlight painted canyon walls in shades of orange and crimson. Desert flowers appeared after rare rains. Towering saguaros stood silently beneath brilliant skies. Mountain forests offered cool shade during the hottest months. Coyotes called across quiet valleys as darkness settled over the land. Nature continued its timeless rhythm. Human events unfolded within it. By the 1830s and 1840s, another powerful force was beginning to reshape North America. Far to the east, the United States was growing rapidly. New settlers crossed rivers and mountains in search of opportunity. Roads expanded westward. Politicians debated borders that had yet to be fully explored. Maps continued changing. Few people living in the quiet valleys of the Southwest could know how dramatically their world would soon transform. Another war, fought between nations rather than neighboring communities, would redraw the map once again. Its consequences would reach every mountain range, every frontier settlement, and every Apache homeland. The familiar world of the Mexican frontier was about to enter an entirely new era, and with it, the long story that would become known as the Apache Wars would begin to take its recognizable shape. In our next chapter, we'll follow the dramatic events of the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the arrival of the United States Army into the Southwest. Changes that forever altered the lives of everyone who called this remarkable land home. Morning arrived quietly across the Southwest. The first rays of sunlight reached the highest mountain peaks before slowly descending into the valleys below. A cool breeze drifted through stands of cottonwood trees. Somewhere in the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled above the open desert. Along a narrow stream, deer emerged cautiously to drink before the growing warmth of the day. To anyone watching from afar, the land appeared timeless. The mountains had stood for millions of years. The rivers continued carving their ancient paths. The desert bloomed after the rains and rested beneath the summer sun, just as it always had. Yet beneath that peaceful landscape, history was beginning to move more quickly than ever before. During the early 1840s, the United States was expanding westward at a remarkable pace. New towns appeared farther and farther from the Atlantic coast. Roads stretched into territories that only a generation earlier had been considered distant frontiers. Steamboats carried travelers along great rivers. Covered wagons rolled across broad plains. Entire families packed their belongings in search of farmland, opportunity, or simply the hope of a different future. Many believed that the nation was destined to continue growing west. This idea became known as manifest destiny. To those who supported it, westward expansion seemed both natural and inevitable. To others, it raised difficult questions. Who already lived upon these lands? Who would govern them? Where should borders truly lie? These questions would soon shape the future of the Southwest. At that time, Texas occupied a unique position. After gaining independence from Mexico in 1836, it existed for several years as its own republic. Then in 1845, Texas joined the United States. Its annexation immediately increased tensions between the United States and Mexico. The two nations disagreed about where Texas's southern boundary truly belonged. Mexico considered the Nueces River the proper border. The United States claimed the Rio Grande, much farther south. Between those rivers stretched hundreds of square miles of disputed land. Neither government wished to surrender its claim. As soldiers gathered near the frontier, diplomatic negotiations became increasingly difficult. In the spring of 1846, fighting began. The Mexican-American War had started. Although much of the conflict occurred far from Apache homelands, its consequences would eventually reach nearly every corner of the Southwest. For many Apache communities, the war itself initially seemed like a struggle between two distant governments. Spanish authority had already disappeared. Now Mexican officials and American officers competed for control of the same vast territory. The mountains remained unchanged. The rivers still flowed, but the flags flying above frontier forts would soon be different. American soldiers entered New Mexico and other northern territories. Many communities surrendered peacefully. Others experienced uncertainty as new officials arrived. In some places, the transition occurred with surprisingly little violence. Residents simply found themselves living under a different government. New laws would eventually follow. New maps would be drawn. Yet daily routines often continued much as before. Farmers still tended their fields. Merchants still loaded wagons. Families still gathered around evening fires. History often changes gradually, even after dramatic political events. While armies marched across the Southwest, the Apache watched carefully for generations. They had adapted to changing circumstances. Spanish soldiers had come. Mexican authorities had followed. Now another government appeared. No one could yet know whether these newcomers would behave differently from those before them. Careful observation remained the wisest course. Many American soldiers found the Southwest unlike anywhere they had previously served. Young recruits from eastern forests or river valleys suddenly encountered towering mesas, endless deserts, and mountain ranges rising unexpectedly from broad plains. The distances astonished them. A journey that appeared short on a map might require several exhausting days. Water determined every march, without dependable springs. Even the strongest army could find itself in serious danger. Military officers quickly realized that local knowledge mattered enormously. Maps remained incomplete. Some rivers disappeared underground. Trails were divided repeatedly among rocky hills. Experienced guides became indispensable. Many learned that survival depended less upon military discipline than upon understanding the land itself. In 1848, the war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The agreement dramatically reshaped North America. Mexico ceded an enormous amount of territory to the United States. This included present-day California, Nevada, Utah, much of Arizona and New Mexico, and portions of several other states. The map changed almost overnight. For governments, it was an extraordinary political achievement. For many people already living there, life became far more complicated. The treaty established borders upon paper. The mountains, however, ignored them. The rivers continued flowing exactly as before. Apache communities suddenly found that lands they had occupied for generations were now claimed by an entirely different nation. No one had asked whether they agreed with these new boundaries. From the perspective of Washington, D.C., the Southwest had become part of the United States. From the perspective of many Apache families, the land remained exactly what it had always been: home. This difference in understanding would become one of the defining challenges of the decades ahead. American officials soon began establishing military forts across the newly acquired territory. Their goals were several: protect settlers, guard important travel routes, maintain communication, demonstrate the presence of federal authority. At first, many of these forts were surprisingly modest. Some consisted of little more than adobe buildings surrounded by simple wooden fences. Others occupied old Mexican military posts. Soldiers worked constantly. They repaired roofs damaged by harsh weather, constructed wells, built stables, created storage buildings for food, tools, and ammunition. Life inside these forts was often quieter than people imagine. Much of a soldier's day involved routine labor: feeding horses, standing watch, repairing wagons, cleaning equipment, writing letters home whenever mail finally arrived. The Southwest demanded patience from everyone. Meanwhile, word spread throughout the eastern United States about opportunities in the newly acquired territories. Explorers described fertile valleys. Surveyors prepared maps. Merchants imagined profitable trade routes, stretching all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Families considered moving west. Some hoped to begin farming, others dreamed of opening stores or ranches. Many simply wished to build better lives. Slowly, the number of newcomers increased. Not all arrived at once. The transformation occurred over years, then decades. Each wagon added another family. Each settlement grew a little larger. Each road became slightly busier. For Apache communities, these gradual changes became increasingly difficult to ignore. A trail used seasonally for generations might suddenly carry regular wagon traffic. A familiar valley now contained livestock belonging to settlers. Springs once visited only occasionally became permanent stopping places for travelers. The land itself remained vast, but the ways people used it were beginning to change. Some meetings remained peaceful. Trade continued in many areas. American officers occasionally sought agreements with Apache leaders. Guides were hired. Information exchanged. Both sides recognized that cooperation often served everyone's interests. Yet uncertainty lingered beneath many of these encounters. Neither side fully understood the other's expectations. American officials often expected fixed agreements covering clearly defined territories. Apache leaders generally represented their own bands rather than every Apache community across the Southwest. Promises that seemed straightforward to one side sometimes carried entirely different meanings for the other. These misunderstandings would grow more significant with time. Nature, meanwhile, continued its quiet work. Summer storms rolled across the mountains. Snow returned each winter to the highest peaks. Coyotes called beneath brilliant stars. The desert waited patiently through long months without rain before blooming once more after sudden thunderstorms. The landscape remained unchanged. It was the human world moving across it that had entered a new chapter. The United States now controlled the Southwest. Its soldiers were building forts. Its settlers were arriving in growing numbers. Its government intended to establish lasting authority across lands that countless generations of Apache families already knew intimately. The stage had been set, not for one single conflict, but for decades of encounters, negotiations, misunderstandings, cooperation, hardship, and change. The long story remembered today as the Apache Wars was slowly beginning. In our next chapter, we'll leave the political maps behind and step inside the frontier forts themselves, discovering what everyday life was really like for the soldiers, scouts, blacksmiths, cooks, doctors, and families who lived along America's newest frontier. The sun had not yet risen above the distant mountains. A cool stillness rested over the desert. The stars lingered overhead, fading slowly as the eastern horizon softened from black to deep blue. Within the walls of a small frontier fort, a bugle broke the silence. Its clear notes echoed across the valley before disappearing into the open country. Another day had begun. For the soldiers stationed throughout the American Southwest, mornings often followed the same quiet routine. Blankets were folded, boots were pulled onto tired feet, campfires were stirred back to life. Coffee simmered in blackened kettles while cooks prepared simple breakfasts of salt pork, beans, biscuits, or whatever supplies happened to be available. The meals were rarely exciting, but they were enough to begin another long day. When many people imagine frontier forts, they picture towering wooden walls, dramatic battles, and constant danger. The reality was often far quieter. Most forts in the Southwest were practical rather than impressive. Some were built from adobe bricks made of mud and straw. Others used local stone or rough-cut timber. Instead of towering castles, they resembled small villages surrounded by workshops, stables, storehouses, officers' quarters, kitchens, hospitals, and long barracks where enlisted men slept side by side. Many forts stood near rivers or dependable springs. Water remained as important to soldiers as it was to everyone else living in the Southwest. Without it, no settlement, civilian or military, could survive for long. Choosing the location of a fort required careful planning. Military engineers searched for reliable water nearby, grazing for horses and mules, and ground that offered good visibility across the surrounding landscape. Even then, nature often remained in control. A promising stream might shrink during a dry summer. Flash floods occasionally swept through low-lying camps. Strong desert winds carried fine dust into every building, covering furniture, clothing, tools, and food with a thin layer of sand. The Southwest demanded patience from everyone. After breakfast came inspection. Uniforms were brushed as neatly as circumstances allowed. Weapons were cleaned, boots were checked. Officers walked carefully through the rows of soldiers, making certain equipment remained in working order. Discipline formed an important part of military life. Yet many young recruits had arrived with little understanding of the land around them. Some had grown up in crowded cities along the East Coast. Others came from farms in the Midwest, where forests, rivers, and green fields looked nothing like the deserts of Arizona or New Mexico. The first months were often the hardest. The dry air cracked their lips. The sun seemed stronger than anything they had ever experienced. Water had to be used carefully. Even breathing felt different beneath the intense afternoon heat. Many soldiers wrote letters describing the Southwest with equal parts admiration and frustration. Some marveled at the endless blue skies. Others missed the shade of eastern forests. Many admitted they had never imagined a landscape so beautiful could also be so unforgiving. Most days passed without any fighting at all. Instead, soldiers spent hours repairing buildings, caring for livestock, digging wells, unloading wagons, chopping firewood, or maintaining roads and bridges. A frontier fort functioned much like a small town. Blacksmiths repaired horseshoes and wagon wheels. Carpenters fixed doors and roofs damaged by weather. Farriers cared for the horses that carried messages and patrols across the territory. Doctors treated illnesses far more often than battle wounds. Simple infections, heat exhaustion, broken bones, and stomach illnesses filled much of a military physician's time. The greatest enemy was frequently not another army. It was disease. Mail days brought rare excitement. Weeks might pass without news from home. Then suddenly a wagon arrived carrying letters bundled inside leather bags. Soldiers gathered eagerly while names were called aloud. Some smiled after reading familiar handwriting from parents, wives, or sweethearts. Others quietly folded disappointing letters into their pockets. A few received no mail at all. For those stationed thousands of miles from home, a single letter could brighten an entire month. The animals living at the fort required constant attention as well. Horses were brushed, fed, and inspected every day. Mules hauled heavy wagons loaded with flour, tools, blankets, and ammunition. Without healthy animals, supplies could not move across the frontier. The soldiers quickly learned that caring for their mounts often meant caring for themselves. Nearby, civilian workers played equally important roles. Blacksmiths, laundresses, cooks, teamsters, merchants, and laborers all contributed to the life of the post. Some officers brought their wives and children. Small gardens appeared beside family quarters. Children laughed while playing beneath cottonwood trees. Schools were occasionally established whenever enough families lived together. Even on the edge of the frontier, ordinary life continued. Birthdays were celebrated. Meals were shared. Music drifted from porches during pleasant evenings. The fort was not simply a military outpost. It was a community. Beyond its walls stretched hundreds of miles of open country. Patrols left regularly, sometimes lasting several days or even weeks. A typical patrol moved slowly. Water barrels were loaded into wagons whenever possible. Extra horses accompanied the column. Scouts rode ahead, carefully watching for signs of recent travel. Tracks pressed into soft earth, broken branches, ashes from an old campfire. The Southwest revealed countless clues to those who knew how to observe them. Many officers soon discovered that local guides possessed knowledge impossible to replace. An experienced scout could identify which direction someone had traveled simply by examining footprints left in dry sand. He could estimate how long ago a fire had burned by touching its ashes. He recognized subtle changes in vegetation that revealed hidden springs or recent rainfall. Books could teach maps. Experience taught the land itself. The forts also became places where very different cultures met. Mexican traders arrived with goods to sell. Local ranchers reported missing livestock. Travelers stopped briefly before continuing westward. Apache leaders occasionally visited to discuss trade, negotiate agreements, or address disputes. Some conversations remained peaceful. Others were marked by uncertainty. Language barriers often complicated even the simplest discussions. Interpreters became invaluable. One misunderstood sentence could alter the meaning of an entire meeting. Many officers genuinely hoped to avoid conflict. They understood that war across such enormous landscapes would be difficult and costly. Likewise, many Apache leaders preferred stable relationships that allowed their families to continue living safely. Yet both sides carried different expectations. The United States Army believed permanent forts represented lasting authority over the region. Many Apache communities viewed those same forts as new arrivals within lands their families had known for generations. Neither perspective disappeared simply because a meeting ended politely. As evening approached, daily routines slowed. The intense heat faded from the desert floor. Long shadows stretched across the parade ground. Smoke drifted lazily upward from cooking fires. Soldiers gathered outside the barracks after supper. Some played cards. Others repaired clothing or polished worn equipment. A few quietly read whatever books or newspapers had reached the fort. Music often filled the cool evening air. Someone might play a fiddle. Another soldier joined with a harmonica. Voices blended together in familiar songs remembered from distant homes. For a little while, the frontier felt less lonely. Above them, the stars returned in astonishing numbers. Far from large cities, the night sky seemed almost endless. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon. Coyotes called from distant hills. The desert cooled quickly after sunset. Within the quiet walls of the fort, lanterns slowly disappeared one by one. Tomorrow would bring another inspection, another patrol, another wagon to unload, another letter to write home. Most soldiers had no way of knowing that history would later remember these isolated posts as important chapters in the Apache Wars. To them, life consisted mostly of ordinary routines, carried out beneath extraordinary skies. Yet beyond the glow of the fort's lanterns, respected Apache leaders were watching the changing frontier with growing concern. They had witnessed new settlements appear, roads expand, and military posts multiply across lands their ancestors had traveled for centuries. Among those leaders were individuals whose names would one day become known throughout the American West, not only for their skill and determination, but for the difficult choices they faced as two very different worlds continued to move closer together. Their stories begin in our next chapter. Another dawn arrived over the mountains. The first light touched the highest ridges of the Chiricahua Mountains before spilling into the valleys below. A gentle breeze stirred the branches of cottonwood trees growing beside a quiet stream. Somewhere among the pines, a woodpecker tapped steadily against an old trunk. Far below, the desert still rested in the cool shadows of morning. To most travelers, these mountains appeared wild and untamed, but to the Apache, they were home. Every canyon held familiar memories. Every spring carried a name. Every trail connected generations of families who had walked these paths long before maps gave the mountains official borders. As the United States established more forts and settlers gradually arrived across the Southwest, the Apache faced questions unlike any their ancestors had known. How should they respond to a rapidly changing frontier? Could peaceful agreements preserve their way of life? Would cooperation be enough? Or would resistance become unavoidable? There was no single answer. One of the most common misunderstandings about the Apache Wars is the belief that the Apache acted as one united nation under one leader. In reality, the Apache consisted of many different bands and communities. Each had its own respected leaders. Each faced unique challenges depending on where they lived. Some preferred negotiation. Others believed stronger action was necessary. Many changed their approach as circumstances evolved. Leadership among the Apache was never based simply upon inherited titles. A respected leader earned trust through experience, wisdom, generosity, courage, and an ability to care for the people who followed him. Authority came through respect, not command. One of the earliest and most respected leaders during this period was Mangas Coloradas. His name, given by Spanish speakers, meant red sleeves. He was a prominent leader among the Membreño Apache and became known across much of the Southwest for both his physical presence and his thoughtful leadership. Accounts written by people who met him often described him as unusually tall, calm, and dignified. Visitors frequently remarked upon his patience during conversations. He understood the changing world surrounding his people. Trade with settlers could bring useful tools. Peace allowed families to hunt, gather, and travel without constant fear. For many years, Mangas Coloradas sought ways to maintain stable relationships whenever possible. Yet he also witnessed increasing pressure upon Apache lands. Mining camps appeared where quiet valleys had once stood. Military patrols traveled routes that had long belonged to Apache families. Settlements expanded, resources became more heavily used. Each new arrival altered the balance that had existed for generations. Like many leaders, he found himself navigating an increasingly difficult path between cooperation and protecting his community. Farther south lived another leader whose name would become well known throughout American history, Cochise. Born among the Chiricahua Apache, Cochise spent much of his early life in the rugged mountain country of southeastern Arizona. It was a landscape perfectly suited to those who understood it. Steep cliffs overlooked narrow passes. Hidden springs lay tucked beneath rocky ledges. Dense oak and pine forests covered higher elevations, while desert valleys stretched far below. To outsiders, these mountains could appear confusing. To Cochise and his people, they offered security, familiarity, and home. Those who knew Cochise often spoke of his intelligence and quiet confidence. He listened carefully before making decisions. He valued loyalty among his family and followers. Like other Apache leaders, he understood every trail, canyon, and water source across his homeland with remarkable precision. Long before conflict intensified, Cochise maintained peaceful relationships with several nearby settlements and travelers. Trade occurred regularly. Conversations took place without hostility. History rarely follows a single direction. Moments of peace and cooperation existed alongside growing tensions. Another remarkable leader emerged during these years, Victorio. A respected leader of the Warm Springs Apache, Victorio became known for his deep concern for his people and his extraordinary understanding of the mountains and deserts they called home. Descriptions written by both friends and opponents often emphasized his calm judgment. He carefully considered each decision rather than acting impulsively. Like many Apache leaders, Victorio hoped his people could continue living upon lands they had occupied for generations. Yet as reservation policies expanded and movement became increasingly restricted, difficult choices lay ahead. His leadership would eventually become one of the defining stories of the later Apache Wars. Alongside him stood another remarkable figure, Nana. By the time many people first heard his name, Nana was already an elderly man. His eyesight had weakened. He suffered from painful arthritis. Walking had become difficult, yet appearances often deceived those who underestimated him. Despite his age, Nana possessed extraordinary determination. Mounted upon a horse, he remained an experienced leader who understood both the landscape and the people around him. Years of experience had taught him patience. He knew when to travel, when to rest, when to avoid unnecessary risks. His knowledge proved every bit as valuable as youthful strength. Together, these leaders shared one important characteristic. They did not seek conflict for its own sake. Their responsibility centered upon protecting families, preserving their communities, and ensuring future generations could survive. Every decision carried enormous consequences. Choosing peace sometimes meant accepting difficult compromises. Choosing resistance risked even greater hardship. There were rarely easy answers. It is also important to remember that leadership extended beyond the men, whose names appear most often in historical records. Women played essential roles within Apache society. They cared for families, prepared food, gathered plants, managed camps, created clothing and tools, preserved traditions through stories, songs, and daily instruction. During times of hardship, their resilience often determined whether entire families endured. Children, too, adapted quickly to frontier life. They learned to ride horses while still very young. They recognized edible plants. They observed weather patterns. They listened carefully to the experiences of their elders. Knowledge remained the greatest inheritance any generation could offer the next. As American settlements continued expanding, communication between Apache leaders and military officers became increasingly frequent. Meetings often took place beneath large shade trees or inside simple military buildings. Interpreters translated conversations between languages that differed not only in words but in ways of understanding the world. An agreement that seemed perfectly clear to one side sometimes carried an entirely different meaning for the other. For American officials, written treaties represented permanent commitments tied to defined boundaries. For many Apache leaders, relationships depended more upon mutual trust, continued respect, and changing circumstances than upon documents stored hundreds of miles away. These differences were not always recognized at the time. Many misunderstandings grew not from dishonesty, but from fundamentally different ways of viewing land, leadership, and responsibility. Even while political tensions increased, ordinary life continued. Families gathered firewood before sunset. Children laughed while chasing one another through mountain meadows. Hunters quietly followed deer trails beneath towering pines. Evening meals were shared beneath skies filled with countless stars. The beauty of the Southwest remained unchanged. Its seasons continued their steady rhythm. Its rivers flowed through ancient valleys. Its mountains stood patiently over every generation. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, the frontier was changing faster than ever before. New roads reached farther into Apache homelands. Mining camps multiplied after fresh discoveries of gold and silver. Stagecoaches crossed territories once visited only by small groups of travelers. Every year brought more newcomers. Every year brought new questions. For leaders like Mangas Coloradas, Cochise, Victorio, and Nana, the challenge was no longer simply adapting to a changing landscape. It was deciding how their people could preserve their lives, traditions, and dignity within a world that seemed to transform with every passing season. In the years ahead, those decisions would lead to long journeys across deserts, hidden mountain trails, difficult negotiations, and exhausting campaigns through some of the most rugged country in North America. And that is where our journey will continue in the next chapter as we follow the long desert campaigns that tested both the United States Army and the Apache, revealing that in the Southwest, endurance often mattered far more than numbers alone. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert. Golden light spilled across broad valleys before climbing the rocky slopes of distant mountains. The air was still cool. Tiny drops of dew clung to blades of grass beside a narrow creek, disappearing as the first warmth of the day settled across the land. Somewhere among the cliffs, a golden eagle soared effortlessly, carried by invisible currents of rising air. The Southwest looked peaceful, timeless. Yet beneath that quiet beauty, thousands of people were constantly moving across the landscape. Soldiers left frontier forts before sunrise. Apache families traveled between seasonal camps. Scouts searched for fresh tracks along dusty trails. Merchants guided heavily loaded wagons between distant settlements. Everyone depended upon the same mountains, the same rivers, the same hidden springs, and the same unforgiving desert. By the middle of the 19th century, the Apache Wars had become less about large armies meeting on open battlefields and more about movement. It was a conflict measured in miles rather than moments, a story of long journeys instead of single battles. Both the United States Army and the Apache quickly discovered that success depended upon understanding the landscape itself. The Southwest refused to reward haste. Patience became every traveler's greatest companion. For soldiers stationed at remote forts, patrols often began long before daylight. A bugle echoed through the quiet post. Coffee simmered over campfires. Horses were saddled beneath lantern light, while the stars still shone overhead. Each man packed only what was necessary: a blanket, a canteen, food that could survive days beneath the desert sun, extra ammunition, simple cooking tools. Everything else added unnecessary weight. Once the gates opened, the patrol disappeared into the vast country beyond. From a distance, the desert sometimes appeared smooth and open. In reality, it was anything but. Dry riverbeds twisted unexpectedly between rocky hills. Steep canyons interrupted seemingly level ground. Sharp volcanic ridges forced travelers to make long detours. Dense stands of mesquite and thorny acacia slowed both horses and wagons. Even experienced officers soon realized that maps revealed only part of the journey. The land itself determined the true route. Water remained the greatest concern. A patrol might travel 20 or 30 miles between dependable springs. During especially dry years, even familiar water sources became uncertain. Soldiers learned to refill every canteen whenever the opportunity appeared. Experienced guides reminded newcomers never to assume another spring waited just over the next ridge. Sometimes it did not. The Apache possessed an extraordinary advantage in this landscape. Generations of experience had taught them every hidden canyon, mountain pass, and seasonal spring within their homelands. A narrow trail invisible to outsiders might connect two valleys separated by towering cliffs. A patch of unusually green vegetation could reveal underground moisture. Even the flight of certain birds sometimes suggested that water lay nearby. These were lessons impossible to master in a single season. They required a lifetime. American officers quickly recognized this reality. Many patrols depended heavily upon scouts who understood the country far better than most soldiers ever could. Some scouts were Mexican frontiersmen. Others were indigenous guides familiar with specific regions. Later, many Apache themselves would serve as scouts for the United States Army, using their remarkable knowledge of the land to guide military expeditions. Without experienced guides, long patrols often became exhausting exercises in uncertainty. Travel demanded constant observation. Tracks left in soft sand revealed recent movement. Broken branches suggested someone had passed through. The ashes of an abandoned campfire still held warmth if travelers had departed only hours before. A horse's hoofprint looked very different from the footprint of a mule. An experienced tracker noticed details that most people walked past without ever seeing. The desert remembered everything. The challenge lay in learning how to read its memories. Days on patrol settled into a quiet rhythm. The cool hours after sunrise allowed steady progress. By late morning, the heat grew stronger. The sun climbed high overhead, leaving little shade except beneath scattered trees or along canyon walls. Whenever possible, men rested during the hottest part of the afternoon. Horses welcomed the pause just as much as their riders. Conversations became quieter. Water was sipped carefully rather than swallowed quickly. Then, as evening approached, the journey continued. Night travel offered welcome relief from the heat. Moonlight illuminated broad valleys with a gentle silver glow. The stars provided familiar points of reference. Many experienced travelers preferred moving beneath the night sky whenever conditions allowed. For Apache families, movement had long been part of everyday life. Travel followed the seasons. Higher mountain forests offered cooler temperatures during the summer months. Lower valleys became more comfortable after autumn arrived. Families adjusted naturally to changing weather, available food, and dependable water. They carried only what they needed. Shelters could be built quickly. Campfires were carefully tended. Every journey reflected generations of accumulated knowledge. Unlike permanent towns, camps remained flexible. If water became scarce or game moved elsewhere, families simply adapted. This ability to move efficiently across difficult country often puzzled military officers accustomed to fix settlements and establish supply lines. The Army relied upon wagons carrying flour, tools, ammunition, medical supplies, and forage for horses. Every wagon slowed a column. Every broken wheel delayed progress. Heavy rains transformed dry washes into rushing streams that blocked crossings for days. Deep sand exhausted draft animals. Mountain trails sometimes became too narrow for wagons altogether. The Apache traveled much more lightly. They needed far less to sustain themselves. That difference shaped nearly every campaign. Nature itself frequently interrupted everyone's plans. Summer monsoon storms arrived with astonishing speed. Dark clouds gathered above distant mountains. Thunder rolled across the valleys. Within minutes, gentle rain became torrents of water racing through normally dry arroyos. Travel stopped immediately. Attempting to cross a flooded wash could prove deadly. Once the storm passed, the desert changed almost overnight. Tiny wildflowers appeared. Fresh grasses covered the valleys. The scent of damp earth filled the cool evening air. It was a reminder that even in one of North America's driest landscapes, life waited patiently for the rain. Winter brought entirely different challenges. Snow covered high mountain passes. Cold winds swept through narrow canyons. Water froze overnight in sheltered valleys. Many people unfamiliar with the Southwest imagine only endless heat. Yet winter in the mountains could be surprisingly harsh. Travel became slower. Fires burned longer after sunset. Warm blankets became precious possessions. The season shaped every decision. Neither soldiers nor Apache leaders could ignore them. Perhaps the greatest lesson learned by everyone who crossed the Southwest was humility. The landscape rarely allowed anyone to feel completely in control. A missed spring, a sudden storm, an injured horse, a broken wagon axle. Any one of these could change an entire journey. Success often depended less upon strength than upon preparation, patience, and respect for the country itself. As the years passed, both sides gradually came to understand one another's abilities. American officers developed enormous respect for Apache knowledge of the land. Apache leaders observed how the Army adapted, building new forts, improving supply routes, and learning from each expedition. The Southwest became a classroom where everyone, willingly or not, continued learning. Yet despite these growing understandings, mistrust remained. The frontier was becoming busier each year. More roads, more ranches, more mining camps, more travelers crossing lands that had once been quiet. The long desert campaigns were never simply contests of endurance. They reflected two different ways of living upon the same landscape, each struggling to adapt as the American Southwest changed more rapidly than anyone could have imagined. Among all the Apache leaders who faced these difficult years, one name would become known around the world. His life would be remembered in books, newspapers, and countless stories, though often in ways that overlooked the quieter moments that shaped him. Before he became a symbol of the Apache Wars, he was simply a young boy growing up among these same mountains, learning the same trails, listening to the same elders, and watching the same sun rise over the desert. His name was Geronimo. And in our next chapter, we will leave the long patrols behind to explore the remarkable life of the man whose story became inseparable from the final years of the Apache Wars. The desert was quiet before sunrise. A cool breeze drifted through the sycamore trees growing beside a narrow stream. High above, the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre stood in gentle shades of blue and gray, their outlines softened by the first light of morning. Birdsong echoed faintly through the canyons. The scent of damp earth lingered after a night of cooler air. For countless generations, these mountains had welcomed each new day in exactly the same way. long before newspapers would print his name, long before photographers would capture his image, long before he became one of the most recognized figures of the American West. A young Apache boy opened his eyes to mornings very much like this one. His Apache name was Goyawe. It is often translated as the one who yawns. The world, however, would come to know him by another name, Geronimo. He was born around the year 1829 among the Bedonkohe Apache, one of the Chiricahua Apache bands whose homeland stretched across portions of what are now Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. His childhood unfolded far from military forts or frontier towns. Instead, it was shaped by mountains, rivers, forests, and desert valleys. Like many Apache children, Goyawe learned first by watching. There were no classrooms, no rows of desks, no written textbooks. His teachers were his parents, his grandparents, his relatives, and the land itself. As a young boy, he accompanied older family members on daily tasks. He watched hunters move silently through pine forests. He learned how to recognize fresh animal tracks pressed into soft earth. He discovered which plants could be eaten safely and which should be avoided. He memorized the locations of springs that remained dependable even during the driest summers. Knowledge came slowly, patiently, one lesson at a time. The mountains became as familiar to him as the rooms of a family home. Certain cliffs marked the beginning of important trails. Particular rock formations pointed travelers toward hidden valleys. The changing colors of the sky hinted at approaching weather. Nothing in the landscape seemed ordinary. Every feature held meaning. As he grew older, horses became an important part of his life. By this time, horses had been part of Apache culture for generations. They allowed families to travel greater distances. Hunters reached remote valleys more easily. Trade became faster. Communication between different bands improved. A skilled horseman earned admiration not simply because he rode well, but because he cared for his animals with patience and respect. Goyawe developed into an excellent rider. Like many young Apache men, he also learned to hunt with remarkable discipline. Hunting demanded silence, observation, endurance. Hours might pass without speaking a single word. The goal was never speed. It was understanding, knowing where deer preferred to graze during cool mornings, recognizing how changing winds carried scent through the trees, learning when to wait and when to move. These same qualities would remain with him throughout his life. As a young man, Goyawe married. Historical accounts identify his wife as Alopi. Together they built a family. Their children grew up surrounded by grandparents, relatives, and the close-knit community that had long sustained Apache life. For a time, his world followed familiar rhythms: hunting, traveling, gathering food, sharing meals around evening fires, watching children play beneath towering cottonwood trees. Like countless families throughout history, they hoped for peaceful years ahead. But life on the frontier was becoming increasingly uncertain. Northern Mexico had experienced decades of tension involving settlements, military expeditions, and raids carried out by various groups. Communities on every side lived with growing insecurity. During one of Goyawe's absences from camp, tragedy struck. In 1851, while he and several others were away trading, Mexican soldiers attacked the camp where his family had been staying near Llanos, in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. When he returned, the camp was silent. His mother had been killed. His wife had been killed. His 3 young children had also lost their lives. Historical accounts describe this moment as one of the defining events of his life. The grief was overwhelming. The quiet camp that had once echoed with familiar voices had become a place of unimaginable loss. For the rest of his life, Geronimo spoke of this event with deep sadness. It changed him profoundly. Many later stories describe him primarily as a warrior. Yet before anything else, he was a husband, a father, a son, a man mourning the loss of nearly everyone closest to him. Understanding this tragedy helps us understand why the years that followed became so difficult. Like many people throughout history who have endured great personal loss, Goyawe sought a way to continue living. His responsibilities to his people remained. The changing Southwest offered little opportunity to retreat from its challenges. The frontier continued shifting around him. Military forces expanded, settlements grew, new roads crossed familiar landscapes. Life demanded difficult choices. According to Apache tradition, Goyawe experienced a powerful spiritual vision during this period of grief. He later believed that protective powers would help guide him through danger if he remained faithful and courageous. Such beliefs gave strength not only to him, but to many Apache communities whose spiritual traditions connected deeply with the natural world. Faith, family, and community remained closely intertwined. Years later, during conflicts with Mexican soldiers, stories spread about Goyawe's remarkable bravery. Some accounts tell that during battle, Mexican troops called upon Saint Jerome for protection, shouting Geronimo. Whether the name arose exactly in that manner remains uncertain, as historians continue to debate its precise origin. What is certain is that the name Geronimo became widely associated with him and eventually appeared in newspapers throughout the United States and beyond. Yet the famous name often overshadowed the quieter realities of his daily life. Much of his time was not spent fighting. Like other Apache leaders, he traveled constantly. He searched for food, cared for horses, helped move families between seasonal camps, participated in councils where important decisions were discussed, watched children grow, listened to elders whose memories reached back long before American soldiers arrived in the Southwest. These ordinary moments rarely appear in popular stories, yet they form the greater part of his life. As American authority expanded after the Mexican-American War, Geronimo found himself living within a world that seemed to change every few years. Military forts multiplied, mining camps appeared in mountain valleys, settlers established ranches across familiar grazing lands. Reservation policies gradually limited where Apache families could travel. Each change narrowed choices that had once seemed limitless. Geronimo did not become an important figure overnight. Instead, responsibility came gradually. Older leaders such as Mangas Coloradas and Cochise had long carried the burden of guiding their people. After their deaths, a younger generation faced decisions that grew increasingly difficult. Geronimo emerged as one of several respected figures during these years, though he was never the sole leader of all Apache people, as popular myths sometimes suggest. Leadership among the Apache remained shared among different bands and respected individuals. As evening settled across the mountains, campfires once again illuminated the valleys. Children listened to stories beneath brilliant stars. The scent of roasting agave drifted through the cool night air. Coyotes called from distant ridges. Nature continued its ancient rhythms, despite the uncertainty surrounding the frontier. Geronimo understood those rhythms as deeply as anyone alive. He knew where rainwater collected after summer storms. He recognized distant mountain silhouettes even beneath moonlight. The land remained his greatest teacher. Soon, however, his knowledge would be tested more severely than ever before. The United States Army had begun relying upon an unexpected group of men whose understanding of the Southwest rivaled that of Geronimo himself. They were Apache scouts. Their story is one of the most fascinating and often misunderstood chapters of the Apache Wars. It is their that our journey will continue in the next chapter. The desert greeted another quiet morning. A pale ribbon of light stretched across the eastern horizon. The night's cool air still lingered beneath the cottonwood trees, while the rocky peaks above slowly caught the first golden rays of the rising sun. Birds called softly from the branches. Somewhere beyond the hills, the steady trickle of a hidden spring echoed through the silence. For a few peaceful moments, the southwest seemed untouched. It was easy to imagine that nothing had changed, yet across this vast landscape, new relationships were forming. Some would surprise both the United States Army and the Apache people themselves. One of the least understood chapters of the Apache Wars involves the Apache Scouts. To many people hearing those words for the first time, they may seem contradictory. How could Apache men serve as scouts for the very army that was engaged in conflict with other Apache bands? The answer lies in understanding that the Apache were never one single nation acting under one leader. They were many different communities. Each band made decisions based upon its own circumstances, its own leaders, and its own responsibilities. Old friendships existed, so did old rivalries. Every community faced different challenges. Some chose resistance, others sought peace. Many simply hoped to protect their families from an increasingly uncertain future. For the United States Army, the need for skilled scouts became obvious almost immediately. Officers arriving from the eastern United States quickly discovered that maps revealed only a small part of the Southwest. The real knowledge existed in the land itself. A narrow canyon might provide safe passage through towering cliffs. A dry wash could conceal fresh tracks for days. A spring hidden beneath a cluster of sycamore trees might determine whether an entire patrol continued its journey or turned back. Without experienced guides, soldiers often found themselves lost or dangerously short of water. No amount of military training could replace years of living in the desert. Gradually, the Army began recruiting Apache men as scouts. Some volunteered because they believed cooperation offered the safest future for their families. Others hoped to secure food, clothing, or steady wages during uncertain times. Some wished to protect their own communities from rival bands. Every scout had personal reasons. History rarely offers simple explanations. The work demanded extraordinary skill. A scout often rode well ahead of the main column. His eyes remained fixed upon the ground as much as the horizon. What appeared to be ordinary sand revealed countless details. The faint outline of a moccasin, a horse's hoof pressed slightly deeper on one side than the other, a broken twig pointing in an unusual direction, an overturned pebble whose lighter underside had only recently been exposed. Each small sign became part of a much larger story. Experienced scouts rarely hurried. They paused often. They knelt beside tracks. They touched the soil with their fingertips. Sometimes they studied the movement of birds or watched deer grazing in the distance. Animals often noticed unfamiliar travelers. Long before people did, the desert was constantly offering information. One simply had to learn how to read it. Army officers soon developed enormous respect for these abilities. General George Crook, one of the officers most closely associated with campaigns in the Southwest, came to believe that Apache scouts were essential to successful operations. He understood that soldiers unfamiliar with the country could not hope to match generations of experience carried by local guides. Crook encouraged cooperation whenever possible. He listened carefully to the advice of his scouts. Many officers gradually learned the same lesson. The Southwest could not be mastered through force alone. It demanded knowledge. A typical scouting patrol moved quietly across the landscape. There was little conversation, the creak of saddle leather, the soft sound of horses' hooves upon dry earth, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. These became the music of long journeys through the desert. Whenever fresh tracks appeared, the column slowed. The scouts moved forward alone. Sometimes they returned within minutes. At other times, hours passed before they rode back with news. Perhaps another group had camped nearby several days earlier. Perhaps travelers were still ahead. Perhaps the tracks belonged to ranchers, merchants, or families simply crossing the frontier. Every possibility required careful judgment. Mistakes carried serious consequences. Despite their importance, Apache scouts often found themselves living between two worlds. Some soldiers viewed them with admiration. Others remained uncertain whom they could trust. Likewise, some Apache communities respected those who sought peace through cooperation. Others questioned their decisions. Life as a scout demanded more than physical endurance. It required emotional resilience as well. Many men found themselves tracking relatives, distant cousins, or people they had known earlier in life. The frontier had become deeply complicated. Families sometimes found themselves making different choices in response to the same changing world. Yet the scouts continued performing countless ordinary duties beyond tracking. They located reliable campsites, identified fresh water, warned patrols about dangerous terrain, interpreted conversations between officers and Apache leaders. Without them, communication would have been even more difficult than it already was. Language itself became another bridge they crossed each day. Many scouts spoke Apache along with Spanish, English, or at least enough of each language to help conversations move forward. An experienced interpreter often prevented misunderstandings before they grew into larger problems. These quiet moments of translation rarely appear in popular histories, yet they may have shaped events as much as any famous meeting. Life on campaign remained physically demanding. Days often began before sunrise and ended long after darkness settled across the mountains. Scouts covered remarkable distances. Some expeditions traveled hundreds of miles through deserts, forests, rocky passes, and river valleys. The weather constantly changed. Blazing afternoons gave way to surprisingly cold nights. Summer thunderstorms transformed dry washes into rushing streams. Winter storms covered high elevations with snow. The scouts adapted because adaptation had always been part of life in the Southwest. Evenings around campfires offered brief moments of rest. Coffee simmered over glowing coals. Simple meals were shared. Stories drifted quietly through the camp while horses grazed nearby. Soldiers and scouts, despite their different backgrounds, often found themselves united by the same ordinary concerns. A worn saddle needing repair, a horse that had thrown a shoe, the hope that tomorrow's march might reach dependable water before the afternoon heat. These shared experiences gradually built mutual respect. Not always, but often enough. History sometimes remembers only moments of conflict, yet much of daily life consisted of cooperation born from necessity. As the years passed, Apache scouts participated in many of the campaigns that marked the final decades of the Apache Wars. Their knowledge helped officers avoid dangerous mountain passes. Their observations prevented patrols from wandering into waterless country. Their understanding of Apache customs allowed negotiations to begin when opportunities arose. They became an indispensable part of frontier life. Still, the work came with a quiet burden. Every successful patrol reminded the scouts that the world they had known as children was changing. More forts appeared, more settlers arrived, more roads crossed valleys that had once known only narrow trails. The Southwest remained beautiful beyond words, but it was no longer the same. The long years of uncertainty were drawing toward their conclusion. Among those who continued to resist life upon the reservations, one familiar name remained at the center of the story: Geronimo. By the mid-1880s, he and the small group traveling with him had become the focus of one final series of exhausting pursuits across Arizona, New Mexico, and the Sierra Madre of northern Mexico. These would become the last great campaigns of the Apache Wars. Their conclusion would mark the end of an era that had shaped the American Southwest for generations. That quiet ending is where our journey will continue in the next chapter. The sun rose gently over the Sierra Madre. Its first light reached the tallest ridges before slowly spilling into the deep valleys below. Morning mist drifted quietly through pine forests. Far beneath the trees, narrow streams reflected the pale colors of dawn. For a few peaceful moments, the mountains appeared untouched by history. They had watched countless generations come and go, long before Spanish explorers arrived, long before Mexico gained its independence, long before American soldiers established forts across the Southwest. The mountains simply remained patient, steady, enduring. By the early 1880s, however, the long years of uncertainty that had shaped the Apache Wars were approaching their final chapter. Many Apache families now lived on reservations. Military forts had become permanent features across the frontier. Railroads connected distant towns that only a generation earlier had seemed impossibly remote. Telegraph wires stretched across deserts where messages had once traveled only on horseback. The Southwest was changing faster than ever before. Yet not everyone accepted these changes. Among those who continued living beyond the reservations was Geronimo, along with a relatively small group of Chiricahua Apache families. It is worth remembering that this group was remarkably small. Popular stories sometimes leave the impression that thousands remained in the mountains. In reality, the number of men, women, and children traveling with Geronimo during these final years was often only a few dozen. Their lives were defined not by large battles, but by constant movement. Every sunrise brought another decision. Where could water be found? Which valley offered the safest campsite? How close were soldiers? How long could the horses continue? Life became a continuous journey. The United States Army understood that bringing the conflict to an end would require a different approach than simply sending more soldiers into the mountains. Several experienced officers had already learned that numbers alone meant very little in the rugged country of Arizona and northern Mexico. The landscape itself always favored those who knew it best. Among the most respected officers assigned to the Southwest was General George Crook. Crook had spent years studying both the land and the people who lived upon it. Unlike some commanders who relied entirely upon military strength, he believed understanding the Apache way of life was equally important. He valued Apache scouts. He listened carefully to interpreters. He preferred patience over unnecessary violence whenever possible. Crook recognized that many years of conflict had exhausted everyone involved. Soldiers grew weary from endless patrols across deserts and mountains. Apache families grew weary from constant movement, uncertainty, and separation from relatives. Settlers hoped for stability. Military officers hoped to reduce costly campaigns. Nearly everyone desired peace, even if they disagreed about how it could be achieved. In 1886, Crook arranged to meet with Geronimo and several other Apache leaders deep within the mountains of northern Mexico. The journey itself required remarkable effort. Officers, interpreters, Apache scouts, and guides traveled through difficult country until both groups finally gathered beneath the shade of towering trees. The conversations lasted several days. Much was discussed, promises were offered, questions were asked. For a brief moment, it appeared that an agreement might finally end the years of uncertainty. Geronimo initially agreed to return to the reservation, but as the journey north began, doubts returned. Stories circulated that imprisonment, or perhaps even execution, might await those who surrendered. Fear spread through the small group. One night, Geronimo and several companions quietly slipped away, disappearing once again into the mountains. The search resumed. Although disappointed, General Crook reportedly accepted responsibility for what had happened. Not long afterward, he was replaced by General Nelson A. Miles. Miles approached the situation somewhat differently. Rather than relying upon repeated military pursuits alone, he combined continued pressure with persistent negotiations. Telegraph lines allowed faster communication between distant forts. Railroads moved supplies and troops more efficiently than ever before. Apache scouts continued providing invaluable knowledge of the mountains. The circle gradually tightened. Still, the pursuit remained anything but easy. The Sierra Madre formed one of the most rugged landscapes in North America. Steep ridges stretched endlessly across the horizon. Deep canyons concealed narrow trails. Dense forests alternated with rocky slopes and isolated meadows. Rainstorms transformed peaceful streams into dangerous torrents. Winter brought freezing temperatures to higher elevations. Summer filled the valleys with relentless heat. Even experienced soldiers struggled through such country. For Geronimo's small group, daily life demanded extraordinary endurance. Food was never guaranteed. Horses required constant care. Children traveled beside their families through difficult terrain. The elderly endured the same exhausting marches as everyone else. The mountains offered protection, but they also demanded sacrifice. Weeks became months. Months became years. Many soldiers later wrote that the greatest challenge was not combat. It was simply keeping pace with people who understood every hidden valley and every mountain pass. Some patrols covered hundreds of miles without seeing another person. Dust-coated uniforms, boots wore thin, horses became exhausted, yet each sunrise signaled another day's journey. Eventually, even the most experienced leaders recognized that the possibilities for continued movement were becoming increasingly limited. The network of forts had expanded. Communication had improved. Apache scouts knew the same country that Geronimo knew. Food and supplies grew harder to obtain. Families had spent years living under constant uncertainty. The future remained unclear, but the present had become exhausting. Late in the summer of 1886, discussions began once more. This time, they took place in Arizona's Skeleton Canyon, a remote place surrounded by rugged hills and quiet desert. The meeting itself was remarkably calm. No great battle preceded it. No dramatic final charge unfolded across the landscape. Instead, people talked. Interpreters translated carefully. Questions were answered. Assurances were offered. On September 4th, 1886, Geronimo agreed to surrender to General Nelson Miles. The moment is often described as the end of the Apache Wars, yet it felt surprisingly quiet. There were no cheering crowds, no grand celebrations echoing across the desert, only a small group of tired families, soldiers who had spent years pursuing them, interpreters who carefully bridged two very different worlds, and the silent mountains watching over them all. For many Americans living far away, newspapers announced that the long conflict had ended. But for the Apache families who surrendered, a new chapter was only beginning. They did not simply return to ordinary life. Instead, they were classified as prisoners of war. Men, women, and children alike would soon begin a journey unlike anything they had previously experienced. They would leave behind the mountains that had shaped every part of their lives. The familiar scent of juniper after rain, the hidden springs known only to generations of travelers, the towering cliffs that had provided shelter for centuries, all would soon fade into memory. As evening settled over Skeleton Canyon, the desert returned to its familiar stillness. The wind whispered gently through the grasses. A hawk circled above distant ridges. The last light of day slowly disappeared beyond the mountains. Nature offered no sign that one of the longest conflicts in American history had reached its conclusion. The rivers continued flowing. The stars returned to the sky. The mountains remained exactly where they had always been. History had changed. The landscape had not. In our next chapter, we'll follow the Apache families as they begin life on the reservations, and for many, as prisoners of war, discovering how daily routines, family life, and traditions adapted to an entirely new world after the final surrender. The first morning on the reservation felt unfamiliar. The sun still rose over the desert. Its warm light still touched the mountains before reaching the valleys below. Cottonwood leaves still fluttered beside quiet streams. The songs of meadowlarks drifted across the cool morning air, just as they always had. Nature continued its ancient rhythm. But for many Apache families, life itself had changed completely. After the surrender at Skeleton Canyon in 1886, the long years of moving across mountains and deserts came to an end. For decades, many Apache families had followed the changing seasons. They had traveled between familiar springs, hunted in mountain forests, gathered plants in desert valleys, and built temporary camps wherever the land offered safety and resources. Now, their movements would be carefully limited. Some Apache groups had already been living on reservations for years before Geronimo's surrender. Others arrived only after the final campaigns ended. Each community faced its own challenges. The best known of these places was the San Carlos Reservation in southeastern Arizona. Established in the 1870s, San Carlos occupied a broad valley surrounded by rugged mountains. To government officials, the reservation represented a place where peace could finally be maintained. Families would receive food supplies, children could attend schools. Farming would gradually replace the older patterns of seasonal travel. Life, it was hoped, would become more settled. For many Apache families, however, the transition proved deeply difficult. The land itself looked familiar in some ways. The same desert stretched toward distant mountains. The same winds carried the scent of creosote after rare rainstorms. Yet daily routines had changed. People who had once decided for themselves when to travel now needed permission to leave. Communities that had moved with the seasons found themselves remaining in one place throughout the year. The adjustment required patience. Each morning began with ordinary work. Women prepared breakfast over cooking fires. Children fetched water from nearby wells or streams. Men repaired shelters, cared for livestock, or worked in small fields where crops had been planted. Corn, beans, squash, and vegetables gradually became more common parts of everyday life. Government-issued farming tools introduced unfamiliar routines. Learning to cultivate crops year after year in the same fields differed greatly from the seasonal movements many families had always known. Some adapted successfully. Others found the change frustrating. The Southwest's dry climate made farming difficult, even for experienced settlers. Rainfall remained unpredictable. Long droughts challenged every harvest. Irrigation ditches required constant maintenance. A single summer without sufficient rain could undo months of careful work. Water remained as precious as ever. Reservation officials distributed food to many families: flour, coffee, sugar, beans, salt, occasionally canned goods. These rations helped during difficult periods, but also created dependence upon supplies that sometimes arrived late or in smaller quantities than expected. When wagons were delayed by weather or poor roads, shortages followed. Patience became a daily necessity. Children experienced some of the greatest changes. Government schools were established with the intention of teaching English, mathematics, reading, writing, and vocational skills. Many educators believed they were preparing children for life within a rapidly changing America. Yet these schools also introduced customs very different from those practiced at home. Some children were encouraged or required to wear different clothing. Hair that held cultural importance was sometimes cut short. Traditional languages were discouraged in certain schools. Daily schedules followed clocks rather than the rhythms of nature. For many families, these changes were painful. Parents hoped their children would succeed in an unfamiliar world while also remembering the stories, language, and traditions that connected them to their ancestors. Despite these challenges, Apache culture did not disappear. Far from it. Evenings remained important times for families. After the day's work ended, relatives gathered together, meals were shared, children listened as grandparents told stories that had been passed down through countless generations. These stories carried history. They explained the natural world. They preserved lessons about courage, generosity, wisdom, and respect. Long before those lessons were ever written in books, they had survived through spoken words. Songs continued to echo across the reservation as well. Ceremonies marking important moments in life remained deeply meaningful. Although some traditions became more difficult to practice openly, families worked quietly to preserve them. Language remained especially important. Every conversation in Apache connected younger generations to centuries of memory. Words carried meanings shaped by mountains, rivers, plants, and seasons that could not always be translated perfectly into English. Meanwhile, the landscape itself offered familiar comfort. Many reservation residents still knew the surrounding hills intimately. Early each morning, sunlight illuminated the same rocky ridges their grandparents had known. Monsoon clouds gathered above distant mountains each summer. Wildflowers still appeared after welcome rains. The desert continued teaching patience to anyone willing to observe it carefully. Nature remained unchanged, even when human lives had been transformed. Relationships between reservation residents and government officials varied greatly. Some agents sincerely hoped to improve living conditions. They worked to establish schools, medical care, and reliable food supplies despite limited resources. Others struggled to understand Apache traditions and made decisions that increased tension rather than reducing it. Like every chapter of history, these years cannot be understood through simple judgments alone. People carried different responsibilities, different beliefs, different hopes for the future. The Army maintained a presence near many reservations, though life gradually became less focused upon military campaigns. Soldiers repaired roads, delivered supplies, protected nearby settlements. Some officers, who had spent years pursuing Apache bands, now found themselves working alongside the very communities they had once encountered only during distant patrols. Time slowly changed relationships, not all at once, but gradually. Many Apache men found new forms of work. Some became ranchers, others worked as laborers, teamsters, blacksmiths, or scouts. Women continued producing beautifully crafted baskets, clothing, and beadwork, preserving artistic traditions that remain admired today. Children grew into adults who understood both Apache customs and the rapidly changing society surrounding them. They learned to move between two worlds. The adjustment was never simple, yet life continued. Births were celebrated, marriages united families, gardens were planted each spring, harvests were gathered each autumn. The ordinary routines of everyday life quietly returned. Looking back today, it is easy to focus only on the hardships of reservation life. Those hardships were certainly real, but so too was the remarkable resilience shown by Apache families who continued caring for one another, preserving their language, passing down stories, and finding ways to maintain their identity despite extraordinary change. The Apache Wars had largely come to an end. The struggle to preserve culture, family, and memory, however, would continue for generations. For Geronimo and the Chiricahua who surrendered with him, another difficult journey still lay ahead. Rather than remaining in their homeland, they would be sent thousands of miles away as prisoners of war to places unlike anything they had ever known. That remarkable journey is where our story will continue in the next chapter. The train rolled steadily eastward. Its iron wheels echoed across bridges, through forests, and over broad rivers that few of the passengers had ever imagined seeing. For the Chiricahua Apache families aboard, the journey felt almost unimaginable. Only weeks earlier, they had been surrounded by the rugged mountains of Arizona and northern Mexico. Now the familiar scent of juniper and sagebrush had disappeared. The dry desert air had given way to heavy humidity. The towering cliffs of the Southwest faded farther behind with every passing mile. For generations, the Apache had measured distance by mountain ranges, rivers, and hidden springs. Now distance was measured by railroad tracks. Following the surrender at Skeleton Canyon in September of 1886, the United States government made an unexpected decision. Rather than allowing Geronimo and the Chiricahua Apache to remain in Arizona, they would be sent far from their homeland. Not only the men who had participated in the final campaigns, but also their wives, their children, their elderly relatives. Even many Apache scouts who had served faithfully alongside the United States Army were included. Officials feared that allowing any of the Chiricahua to remain in the Southwest might encourage future conflict. As a result, nearly the entire community became prisoners of war. It was an unusual decision. Unlike most prisoners of war, these families had not been captured during a conflict between separate nations, yet they would remain under military supervision for decades. The first destination was Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. The journey itself covered nearly 2,000 miles. For many Apache families, it was the longest trip of their lives. As the train crossed the Great Plains and the forests of the American South, the landscape changed completely. The endless desert skies disappeared behind dense woodlands. Towering pine forests gave way to thick oak groves draped with Spanish moss. Warm ocean breezes replaced the dry mountain air. Everything looked unfamiliar. Everything smelled different. Even the birds sounded different. Fort Marion had originally been built centuries earlier by the Spanish. Its massive stone walls overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. For soldiers, it represented a historic military post. For the Apache families arriving there, it became another temporary home they had never chosen. Military officials attempted to provide food, clothing, and shelter, yet adapting to Florida proved remarkably difficult. The climate alone presented enormous challenges. The Southwest's dry air had shaped Apache life for generations. Florida offered something entirely different. The air remained warm and damp throughout much of the year. Summer heat lingered even after sunset. Frequent rainstorms soaked the ground. Mosquitoes filled the evenings. New insects, unfamiliar plants, and different illnesses became constant companions. Many prisoners became sick. Diseases that spread easily in the humid climate proved especially dangerous to people whose immune systems had developed in a very different environment. Doctors worked to provide treatment, but 19th century medicine remained limited. Several Apache men, women, and children died during these early years in captivity. Their families mourned far from the mountains where generations of their ancestors had lived. For those who survived, daily life gradually settled into routine. Each morning began much like any military post. Breakfast was prepared, clothing repaired, living quarters cleaned. Children played whenever they found opportunities. Parents cared for their families, using whatever resources were available. Ordinary life continued even under extraordinary circumstances. One remarkable aspect of this period was the curiosity that developed between the Apache prisoners and many local residents. Visitors occasionally came to observe the prisoners. Some purchased handmade crafts, others simply wished to meet people whose names had recently filled newspapers across the country. Geronimo himself became an object of considerable public fascination. Journalists requested interviews. Photographers asked him to pose for portraits. Artists sketched his likeness. Yet despite growing fame, he remained a prisoner. His image traveled freely across America. He did not. After several years, officials decided another move was necessary. In 1887, many of the Apache prisoners were transferred to Mount Vernon Barracks in southern Alabama. Although closer to the Gulf Coast than Florida, the climate remained warm and humid. Once again, families adjusted to unfamiliar surroundings. Life at Mount Vernon followed many of the same routines. Gardens were planted, children attended school, military guards supervised the community. Some Apache men worked at various tasks around the post. Women continued creating baskets, beadwork, and clothing that reflected traditions carried from the Southwest. Even in unfamiliar places, culture remained alive. Perhaps the greatest source of strength came from family itself. Grandparents continued telling stories. Parents taught children their language. Songs remembered from Arizona still echoed softly during quiet evenings. Although the mountains lay far away, memories traveled wherever the people carried them. The years passed slowly. Children, who'd been very young at the time of surrender, gradually became teenagers. Some barely remembered life before the long train journey east. Others listened carefully whenever elders described the Chiricahua Mountains, the Gila Wilderness, or the familiar springs hidden among the desert hills. The homeland increasingly lived within memory. In 1894, another transfer took place. This time, the prisoners traveled west once again, though not all the way home. Their destination was Fort Sill, located in what is now Oklahoma. The landscape differed from both Florida and Arizona. Broad grasslands stretched toward distant horizons. Gentle rolling hills replaced towering mountain ranges. Winters brought colder weather than many had experienced in years. While Fort Sill still represented military supervision, life gradually became more stable. Some families built more permanent homes. Small gardens flourished. Livestock were raised. Children continued attending school. Work opportunities slowly increased. Although they remained classified as prisoners of war, everyday routines became somewhat more predictable. Geronimo spent the remainder of his life at Fort Sill. As the years passed, he became one of the most recognized Native American figures in the United States. He attended fairs and public exhibitions. He sold bows, arrows, walking sticks, and signed photographs to visitors. At the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, thousands of people came hoping to see him. 5 years later, he participated in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in Washington, D.C. Many spectators cheered as he rode past. Yet despite these public appearances, Geronimo repeatedly requested permission to return permanently to his homeland in Arizona. Those requests were never granted. He remained a prisoner of war until his death in 1909. His story reminds us that public recognition and personal freedom are not always the same thing. While newspapers celebrated his fame, his greatest wish remained remarkably simple. He wanted to go home. For the Chiricahua Apache as a whole, official prisoner of war status continued until 1913. Only then, 27 years after the surrender at Skeleton Canyon, were surviving members finally released. Some chose to remain in Oklahoma. Others accepted the opportunity to relocate to the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. A few families eventually found their way back to parts of the Southwest, though never again exactly as before. Their homeland had changed. They had changed. The world itself had changed. Yet through every move, from Arizona to Florida, from Alabama to Oklahoma, one thing endured. Families continued speaking their language. Children learned stories from their grandparents. Songs survived. Ceremonies continued whenever possible. Identity proved stronger than geography. The mountains lived on in memory, in tradition, and in the hearts of those who had once called them home. In our next chapter, we'll leave the years of imprisonment behind and journey into the present day, discovering how Apache communities continue to preserve their language, culture, and traditions while honoring a remarkable history that still shapes the American Southwest. The sun rose slowly over the white mountains of eastern Arizona. Morning light drifted across forests of ponderosa pine before reaching the lower desert valleys, where saguaro cacti stood quietly beneath an endless blue sky. A cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and juniper through the canyons. Somewhere nearby, a creek flowed gently over smooth stones, just as it had for countless generations. The landscape looked much as it always had. The mountains still watched over the valleys. The rivers still followed ancient paths. The season still arrived with quiet certainty. But the people living among these familiar places had entered a new century. By the early 20th century, the Apache Wars had become history. The military campaigns had ended. The frontier forts that once bustled with soldiers gradually became quieter. Stagecoach roads gave way to highways. Railroad whistles became less common as automobiles appeared across the Southwest. Mining camps that had once filled entire valleys slowly emptied. The American West continued changing. Yet through all those changes, the Apache people remained. Today, several federally recognized Apache tribes continue to call the Southwest home. Among them are the San Carlos Apache Tribe, the White Mountain Apache Tribe, the Tonto Apache Tribe, the Yavapai Apache Nation, the Mescalero Apache Tribe in New Mexico, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Fort Sill Apache Tribe, and the Lipan Apache Tribe of Texas, whose history continues through descendants and cultural organizations. Each community has its own history, its own traditions, its own leadership. Although they share common roots, each nation preserves a unique identity shaped by generations of experience. For many visitors arriving in the Southwest today, it is easy to focus only on the spectacular scenery, the towering cliffs, the pine-covered mountains, the broad deserts stretching toward distant horizons. But for Apache communities, these landscapes are much more than beautiful places. They are living homelands. A particular mountain may hold stories passed down for centuries. A spring may be remembered because generations gathered there during difficult summers. A canyon may appear ordinary to a traveler, yet represent an important chapter in a family's history. The land continues to speak through memory. Language remains one of the strongest connections to that memory. For generations, Apache elders have worked patiently to preserve their languages. Like many indigenous languages throughout North America, Apache languages faced difficult challenges during the 20th century. Many children were educated primarily in English. Some families worried that younger generations might lose the ability to speak the words their grandparents had known. In response, communities began creating language programs, school lessons, dictionaries, recordings, and cultural workshops. Today, elders and teachers continue passing those words to children, ensuring that the sounds of the Apache language remain part of everyday life. Every language carries a unique way of seeing the world. Certain expressions describe landscapes with remarkable precision. Others preserve ideas that cannot easily be translated into English. When a language survives, It carries generations of history with it. Traditional knowledge has also endured. Many Apache families continue gathering native plants used for food, medicine, or ceremonies. Skilled basket makers weave intricate patterns using willow, devil's claw, and other natural materials collected with great care. Beadwork remains an important form of artistic expression. Silversmiths create jewelry that reflects both older traditions and more recent influences. These crafts are not simply beautiful objects, they represent knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. Ceremonies continue to play an important role as well. Some remain private, shared only within the community. Others are celebrated during cultural gatherings, where songs, dances, and stories strengthen the bonds between families. Visitors are often reminded that not every tradition is intended for public display. Respect has always been one of the most important lessons taught throughout Apache culture. Many communities also host annual celebrations that welcome guests from neighboring tribes and surrounding towns. Children race across open fields. Traditional foods are prepared. Drums echo across the evening air. Elders visit with relatives they may not have seen for months. Young people learn dances that connect them with generations before them. These gatherings remind everyone that culture is not something preserved only inside museums. It is something lived every single day. Education has become another important part of preserving Apache history. Schools on reservations often teach both academic subjects and cultural traditions. Students learn about mathematics and science while also hearing the stories of their own ancestors. Museums, cultural centers, and tribal archives protect photographs, recordings, artwork, and historical documents that might otherwise be lost. Many Apache historians now write books, produce films, and record oral histories from elders whose memories reach back across nearly a century. Technology, once unimaginable during the Apache Wars, now helps preserve traditions for future generations. The natural world continues teaching its own lessons. Young people still hike mountain trails with parents and grandparents. They learn to recognize animal tracks pressed into soft earth after rain. They discover which plants bloom first each spring. They watch monsoon clouds gather over distant peaks during warm summer afternoons. Although modern life has changed many routines, the land remains an important classroom. Its lessons are patient, just as they always have been. Modern Apache communities also contribute to the broader economy of the Southwest. Many tribal governments operate businesses, tourism programs, hotels, forestry services, wildlife conservation projects, and cultural enterprises. Healthcare facilities, colleges, environmental programs, and youth organizations all play important roles within their communities. Like every society, Apache nations continue balancing tradition with the opportunities and challenges of modern life. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Apache Wars did not erase Apache identity. The years of conflict brought enormous hardship. Families were separated, communities were displaced, languages faced pressure. Ancient patterns of life changed forever, yet resilience proved stronger than many people expected. The stories survived, the songs survived, the language survived, the people survived. Today, travelers driving across Arizona or New Mexico may pass through landscapes once known intimately by Cochise, Victorio, Nana, Geronimo, Mangas Coloradas, and countless others whose names never appeared in history books. The mountains remain, the rivers continue flowing. The wind still carries the scent of sage after a desert rain. The land remembers, and so do the people. As evening settles across the Southwest once more, shadows lengthen beneath towering pines. The last sunlight glows upon distant mesas. Coyotes begin their familiar songs, beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. It is a peaceful scene, one that reminds us that history is never truly finished. It continues through families, languages, traditions, and the quiet places where memory still lives. In our final chapter, we will leave behind dates and historical events to reflect upon everything we have witnessed together, from the first peaceful mornings in the Apache homeland to the enduring legacy that continues across the deserts and mountains of the American Southwest today. Our journey is almost complete. The sun is beginning to sink below the western horizon. Its warm light stretches across the desert one final time, painting the cliffs in shades of gold, amber, and soft crimson. Long shadows reach across quiet valleys. The evening breeze moves gently through the grasses. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk glides effortlessly on the cooling air before disappearing beyond the mountains. Soon, the stars will return. The same stars that watched over generations of Apache families. The same stars that guided Spanish explorers, Mexican traders, American soldiers, settlers, scouts, and travelers. The sky has witnessed every chapter of this story, yet it has remained unchanged. As we sit quietly beside this imagined campfire, it is worth reflecting on everything we have seen together. We began our journey long before the Apache Wars themselves. We met the Apache people not as characters in a battle, but as families living across one of North America's most remarkable landscapes. We walked through forests of ponderosa pine. We crossed broad desert valleys filled with towering saguaro cacti. We visited hidden springs where clear water flowed from the rocks. We watched children learn from their parents. We listened to elders tell stories beneath the evening sky. Long before maps divided borders, the Apache already knew these mountains intimately. They understood where rainwater gathered after summer storms. They knew which trails remained cool during the hottest afternoons. They recognized the songs of birds announcing the changing seasons. The land was more than a place to live, it was a trusted companion. Then history began to change. Spanish explorers entered the Southwest carrying unfamiliar customs, animals, and ideas. Centuries later, Mexico inherited the northern frontier. After that came the United States, bringing new settlements, military forts, railroads, and growing towns. Each generation inherited a different world than the one before it. None of these changes happened overnight. History rarely moves in sudden leaps. More often, it unfolds slowly. One road becomes two. A trading post becomes a village grows into a town, a narrow trail becomes a railroad. Then, almost before anyone notices, an entire landscape has been transformed. Throughout these changes, people often made decisions with limited choices before them. Apache leaders sought ways to protect their communities. Military officers struggled to carry out difficult assignments across enormous distances. Settlers searched for new opportunities. Scouts walked carefully between different worlds. Parents, regardless of background, worried about their children. Grandparents hoped traditions would survive. These ordinary human concerns connected people even when they disagreed profoundly about the future. The Apache Wars themselves lasted for many decades. They stretched across deserts, forests, rivers, and mountains that tested everyone who traveled through them. We learned that the conflict was rarely simple. It was not one continuous struggle between two clearly defined sides. Instead, it involved many Apache bands, many military commanders, many governments, and countless individual decisions. Every valley held its own story. Every family experienced history differently. We met remarkable leaders: Mangas Coloradas, Cochise, Victorio, Nana, Geronimo. Each approached leadership in different ways. Each carried the responsibilities of protecting families during uncertain times. Yet history also belongs to those whose names never appeared in official reports. The mothers preparing meals before sunrise, the children gathering firewood, the scouts reading nearly invisible tracks across dry ground, the soldiers writing letters home after long patrols, the interpreters patiently translating conversations between people who spoke different languages. Without them, history could never have unfolded as it did. One lesson appeared again and again throughout our journey. The Southwest itself shaped every decision. Water determined where people traveled. Mountains offered shelter. Storms delayed journeys. Winter snow closed high passes. Summer heat tested endurance. Nature was never merely a backdrop. It was one of history's most powerful participants. Even today, visitors standing among those same mountains often experience something difficult to describe. A feeling of great age, a quiet reminder that human lives, no matter how eventful, pass far more quickly than rivers carving stone or forests growing across mountain slopes. The Apache Wars eventually came to an end. The military campaign stopped. Families moved onto reservations. Others spent decades as prisoners of war, far from home. Entire communities faced extraordinary challenges, adapting to new circumstances. Those chapters remind us that endings are rarely as simple as history books sometimes suggest. An end to fighting does not immediately erase grief, nor does it erase memory. Yet memory itself can become a source of strength. We saw how Apache communities preserved their languages, protected their ceremonies, continued telling stories, raised new generations who carried forward traditions despite enormous change. Culture proved remarkably resilient. Like a cottonwood growing beside a desert stream, its roots reached deeper than many people realized. Perhaps that is one of the most meaningful lessons history offers. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to endure. Communities adapt, families rebuild, languages survive because someone chooses to teach a child one more word. Stories survive because an elder tells them one more time beneath the evening sky. The passage of time changes every generation, yet some things remain: respect, kindness, curiosity, the desire to belong, the hope that our children will inherit a better future. Those hopes are as old as humanity itself. As darkness gently settles across the Southwest, the desert begins its nightly transformation. The day's warmth slowly leaves the rocks. Owls awaken beneath the branches of ancient cottonwoods. Crickets begin their quiet chorus. The Milky Way gradually stretches from one horizon to the other, brighter than many people today ever have the chance to see. It is the same night sky that Apache children admired centuries ago, the same sky that watched over frontier forts, the same sky beneath which weary travelers rested after long days on dusty trails. It asks for nothing, it simply remains. Perhaps that is why places like these inspire such reflection. The mountains do not judge those who walked among them. They remember everyone equally. The hunter searching for deer, the scout following faint tracks, the soldier climbing a rocky pass, the child laughing beside a stream, the elder watching another sunset. Each became part of the landscape's long memory. And now, so have we. Not because we stood there ourselves, but because for a little while we slowed down enough to imagine these lives with patience and care. History often feels distant when it is reduced to names and dates. But when we picture ordinary mornings, the smell of fresh coffee rising from a frontier camp, the sound of wind moving through pine trees, the laughter of children chasing one another across an open meadow, the quiet work of repairing a saddle or weaving a basket, the past becomes something much more familiar. It becomes human. As our campfire burns lower, its glowing embers slowly fade into the cool desert night. The mountains become silhouettes beneath countless stars. The breeze grows softer. The world becomes wonderfully still. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through the history of the Apache Wars. May the stories of resilience, courage, family, and endurance remain with you long after tonight. And as the desert settles into peaceful silence, may you find yourself doing the same. Good night.